From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. I'm Kaylee Lyons. Kamala Harris gains ground against Donald Trump in a new series of polls out today as she joins her running mate Tim Walz in their first sit-down interview set to air this evening. We'll have more on the state of the race with Kyle Kondik of Sabato's Crystal Ball at the University of Virginia, and we'll zero in on the economy as an issue with Betsey Stevenson from the University of Michigan. Plus, we'll have the latest with foreign policy this hour as National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan wraps up a 3-day visit to Beijing. But we begin this evening with Vice President Kamala Harris's long-awaited interview. It's set to air this evening after being taped earlier in the day alongside running mate Tim Walz. Here's a clip that CNN released ahead of tonight's full conversation.
Dana, I think the most important and most significant aspect of my policy perspective and decisions is my values have not changed. My value around what we need to do to secure our border, that value has not changed. I spent 2 terms as the Attorney General of California prosecuting transnational criminal organizations, violations of American laws regarding the illegal passage of guns, drugs, and human beings across our border. My values have not changed.
Joining me now for more is Bloomberg Government's Kate Ackley. So, Kate, obviously that was in response to questioning around the flip-flopping we have seen Harris do on a number of issues compared to a primary campaign in 2019 to what we're hearing now on issues like the border, on issues like energy and climate change. How should we read the values not being changed? The Donald Trump campaign is responding by saying, OK, her values show she's still a radical left-leaning Democrat.
Well, that's going to be the Republican message, San Francisco liberal, right? That's what we've heard a lot about. So probably whatever she says, they're either going to say she's flip-flopping or that's not what she actually believes. But, this is a significant moment. I mean, she did not go through the typical primary to become the nominee. This has been on a much more expedited course, just talking about several weeks, really. So this is the first time to, have a reporter sit down and question about some of the changes from when she did run in the presidential primary in 2019 and her, other positions that she had as a Senate candidate. And she's mentioning in that clip, being Attorney General of California.
Well, of course, it's worth pointing out as this is the first interview she's doing since becoming the nominee. She's not doing it on her own. Tim Walz was there beside her for the entire conversation. Republicans have been quick to criticize that decision as well. Clearly, there is historic precedent for doing an interview of the 2 running mates together. We saw this in Clinton and Kaine and even Biden and Obama in 2008. But why do this when she has been facing so much criticism for not talking to press enough?
Well, it is common to have the running mate, especially right after the convention or right before the convention, depending on when the running mate is named. This is unusual just because you didn't have sort of the glare of the media spotlight through a long primary where you had somebody air all of their positions and be questioned not just by reporters and, the media, if you will, but questioned by their rivals. And so there hasn't been that, and there hasn't been a debate. Now, we're about to get into the first debate soon. But this is really a unique opportunity. The fact that it's both of them is not particularly unusual at this time of a campaign, but it's unusual because the primary was as it was. It was a truncated period.
Indeed. This is unprecedented, really, in modern American politics. It's also worth pointing out this interview was conducted or recorded while Harris and Walz are in Georgia. They're finishing up their 2-day bus tour. They'll have a rally in Savannah later on this hour. And it comes at a time in which Fox News releases a poll that shows they actually are doing better in Georgia. They have Harris up by 2 points in Georgia and in Nevada, up by 1 point in Arizona. Trump still up 1 point in North Carolina. All of this is in the margin of error, Kate, but this does suggest that she has a wider map here than Joe Biden did when he left the race.
That's totally clear. She does have a wider map. And I think Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell was talking today and said he thought what Democrats did was pretty smart because he thought Joe Biden was going to lose. And it does seem, if you believe the polling, that seems the case, that he was not doing well in a number of battleground states that Vice President Harris has picked up steam in. So that probably explains why do this bus tour through Georgia, or why try to reach maybe not necessarily red voters, but red state voters and going into red territory, red congressional districts.
Yeah, it is noteworthy that they've been targeting rural areas with a high concentration of black population as well. The other thing to consider in this poll is what it reveals about the Senate races in some of these states, like in Arizona. They have Ruben Gallego up by double digits against Carrie Lake. Jackie Rosen, who was seen as a more vulnerable incumbent Democratic senator in Nevada, also leading her opponent by double digits. What does that say about the down ballot implications of the Harris candidacy?
It's hard to know if this is directly related to Harris and the momentum, and also they had a good convention last week. Democrats did. So is that sort of coming off of that? But the Senate map, we want to see what's happening in Montana, where Senator John Tester is, probably in the fight for his political life. What about Ohio? It's clear this is likely to be a very close Senate next Congress as well. But it's hard to directly say, is this because of momentum from Harris? Is this enthusiasm because of Harris being atop the ticket? Perhaps it's not hurting in those Senate battlegrounds.
And of course, this is a reminder that as much policy as Harris might outline in this interview tonight, there's only so much she herself could achieve if she wins. You need Congress to do a lot of these things as well. Bloomberg's Kate Ackley, thank you so much. Now, also today, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan wrapped up a 3-day visit to China. That saw him take part in talks aimed at stabilizing the relationship between these global superpowers and sit down one-on-one with Xi Jinping. He spoke to press in Beijing.
It's rare that we have the opportunity to have this kind of exchange, and given the state of the world and the need for us to responsibly manage the U.S.-China relationship, I think this is a very important meeting.
Joining me now for more is Bloomberg's Nick Wadhams, who leads our national security coverage. So it's not just about the exchanges that took place over the last 3 days while he was there in person in Beijing, but also about exchanges that could happen in the future, right, in terms of a phone call between Xi Jinping and Joe Biden.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're trying to see is the Biden administration essentially running through the tape here with China, but also essentially saying, listen, we don't want any surprises. We don't want any funny business. We have an election coming up. China is going to be a somewhat important issue in this campaign, given that Donald Trump has basically made China bashing part of his campaign, accusing Democrats of being weak on China. So I think what you're really seeing here is a desire to maintain steady order. Let's just keep things smooth. There were no deliverables out of this. The point was the conversation. As he mentioned, these exchanges are very rare, but, very deliberate. Fact that he went there. He said the point was the talks. He comes back. Usually he would go and have sort of a laundry list of items that got achieved from this thing. But really at this point, it just seems to be like, hey, let's keep things cool and collected.
Well, something else we heard from Jake Sullivan while he was in China was the idea that Kamala Harris has the foreign policy experience, specifically when it comes to this relationship, having interfaced with Chinese leaders. To what extent is that actually true? How has the vice president been influencing policy decisions when it comes to China and things like export controls, for example?
I don't think she has been. I mean, the administration has said she's been deeply in these councils. I mean, it was interesting as part of the effort to establish her sort of foreign policy credential. her national security advisor, Phil Gordon, sent around a memo at one point saying that she had met with Xi Jinping during a visit to Asia, and this was an important indicator of how the U.S. is trying to shape the U.S.-China relationship. I mean, that was really more of a handshake more than anything else. So it's a bit of a tell there that when the administration cites this very short meeting that Kamala Harris had with Xi Jinping as indication of her foreign policy chops. I mean, listen, on the other hand, a lot of presidents have come to office or been elected having had zero interaction with China. I mean, I think the only one previously to have actually been there before they served in office was George H.W. Bush. He had been the ambassador there. So it's not like this is a particularly new thing, and she did have some of these interactions as vice president. But certainly there is this not quite myth-making, but certainly an effort to sort of say, listen, she was deep in this stuff. But this was policy that was essentially on a railroad track for a long time that she wouldn't have necessarily influenced.
And finally, it's obviously about the U.S.-China relationship, but the U.S. is also concerned about China's relationship with others, including, for example, Russia, given the ongoing war in Ukraine. To what extent can we still expect this administration to put pressure on China in that regard, even as they seek normalcy elsewhere?
Well, I mean, this has been the great tension in this administration, because on the one hand, they say, listen, we now see China as essentially being an enabler, an important enabler of the Russian war in Ukraine. They have not said they're providing lethal weaponry, but they're coming up pretty darn close to that line. So they want China to cut that out. But at the same time, they really do not want to provoke another major round of tensions, especially given these two countries' economic interdependence. And, China's own economy is struggling. So, really the fear again here is no October surprises. Let's not get into any sort of round of major tension before the election and just keep things calm for the time being.
All right, Bloomberg's Nick Wadhams, thank you so much. Now, coming up, we'll take a look at how the economic data that was released today may impact the presidential race. Betsey Stevenson, professor of public policy and economics at the University of Michigan, joins next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Vice President Harris is going to have to talk to the American people about their number one priority when it comes to the economy, which is the cost of living, the cost of things that matter most, a roof over your head and food on the table. When it comes to both housing and grocery, what she can do is talk about what she plans to do with 4 more years, but also what she is already doing this very week in her administration to bring down the cost of things that matter most.
That was Lindsay Owens, executive director at Groundwork Collaborative and Groundwork Action, speaking with me earlier today about what Kamala Harris needs to message to voters about the economy, with new data out today showing it was stronger than expected in the second quarter. Joining me now for more here on Bloomberg TV and radio, Betsey Stevenson, professor of public policy and economics at the University of Michigan and Bloomberg opinion columnist. So, Betsey, obviously the data we got is backward looking. In the second quarter, it was actually 3% GDP growth, we understand, with this revision. Personal consumption up 2.9%. So the consumer engine is revving perhaps a bit more than we thought. What does this signal about whether or not we should expect to see more deterioration in the economy leading up to November, or for it to remain strong before voters head to the polls?
Well, first, one of the reasons I think consumers have been so grumbling and so complaining is because they are continuing to spend. And that's great for the economy. It's actually great for households that they're able to do that. And it's certainly going to prevent us from having a consumer-driven slump. But what they're doing is they're out there spending more money on high prices, and it's making them really frustrated. You asked, what does this mean for the economy? It means the economy is stronger than we thought, and it's been pretty strong. So we don't have any real recession fears ahead of us. But what we do need to do is ensure that inflation continues to come down all the way to that Fed target of 2%. And we want to do that without seeing unemployment get much higher. Even though we saw that stronger GDP growth, we have seen the labor market weakening, and we really don't want to see it weakening by much more. So I certainly still hope that the Fed is planning on cutting rates in September because it is time to take our foot off the brakes a little bit. and allow the economy a little bit more breathing room to be able to ensure that people keep their jobs. But I think what we see is that somehow this American consumer has kept on keeping on, even in the face of rising unemployment and higher prices than they were expecting.
Well, and when it comes to addressing higher prices and just addressing the economy overall, we're starting to get the broad outlines of what each of the presidential candidates would like to do. Donald Trump obviously is advocating for tax cuts. Kamala Harris is talking about subsidizing things like housing and down payments for first-time home buyers. And it does raise the question of how economically and fiscally responsible these kind of ideas are. I spoke about that with Catherine Edwards, economic policy consultant at the Rand Corporation, earlier this week, and this is what she told me.
It's a more sure problem on the Trump campaign side because they are proposing a tax cut that costs over $4 trillion. That's one decision that has to be made. And if they pass it, we are $4 trillion more in the hole. Harris's proposals are piecemeal, right? One could cost $500 billion, one could cost $1 trillion, but that would still be dwarfed by a single policy that Trump is completely and totally committed to.
Betsey, how are you analyzing the potential economic consequences, be them for growth or inflation, of what we've heard from each of them so far?
What you just played was interesting because it's sort of like a risk assessment. Like, boy, if Trump's successful, we're definitely in trouble. And Harris could fail a whole bunch of different times, so who knows how much she'll end up spending. But look, I think that's not I want to look at it in a different way. And the thing is, we already don't bring in enough revenue to pay for what American people want. When you ask American people about the programs they get, when you ask them about things like Social Security and Medicare, they like their government programs, and we're bringing in too little revenue, right? So like Donald Trump has proposed cutting taxes on Social Security. Do you know what that will mean? Cutting Social Security benefits because there won't be enough revenue to pay the benefits that are promised. So we have to think about fiscal responsibility is about bringing enough revenue to pay for the things people want. What we hear from both of them, though, is very populist ideas. So Trump's sticking with that sort of right-leaning conservative populist idea of, well, we'll just give everybody all their money back. And we won't tell them that means we're going to have to gut the programs they've been counting on, like Social Security. And Harris is leaning, into a different kind of populist programs, like we're going to fight the corporations that are raising prices on you. Now, look, price controls, it is a policy that we know a lot about because it has a perfect track record of literally never working. So you've got Harris leaning into things like price controls. Although if you read what she's really saying, I think what she's saying is, look, we're not going to let companies take advantage of you. And we already, almost every state already has rules on the books that say companies can't take advantage of you when there's sort of like a quick change in demand that could lead them to do price gouging. That's illegal in most states. I think she wants a national policy on that. I don't know that it would actually do that much. If we turn to things like her spending program, like she wants to give a lot of money away to first-time home buyers. That would certainly be fiscally irresponsible and put a lot more money into the housing market if that's the only thing we did. But I think it's important to realize that the government already puts tons of money into the housing market through the mortgage interest deduction. And that's mostly going to wealthy families buying big houses. So my hope is she's got a great proposal, $25,000 for first-time home buyers is a great idea. Let's just hope it's balanced with, maybe reducing the handouts we're giving to wealthier families with big houses.
Well, that's not the only thing that Kamala Harris has put out there. She is right now in Georgia. She's on stage at her rally in Savannah. And before arriving there, she was speaking with some small business owners, saying that one of her priorities is to invest in small businesses. So next week, she will be rolling out a tax credit for startups and for small businesses. This is tax credits, right? It still raises the same revenue question, Betsey?
Yeah, exactly. So, tax credits is what economists call spending through the tax code. It cuts into our revenue. It's another spending program. You gussy it up in a way that it looks like a tax program, but it's just really another spending program. I can understand why she wants to lean into that. If you look at why the U.S. economy has been so successful compared to other countries around the world in maintaining ongoing economic growth and bringing inflation down with very little pain in terms of a contracting economy, in terms of job loss, it's been because we have had an unprecedented surge in new business formation. And I think the job of anyone in government right now is to figure out how to keep that business dynamism that really exploded coming out of the pandemic to continue growing. So I'm thrilled that she has policies there. It's not surprising that she wants to put some financial incentives behind it. At the end of the day, what it's going to come down to is that's a great way for us to be creating incentives. But how are we paying for it, and what is it being balanced with? Are we balancing that with corporate tax reform that might raise taxes on more established corporations and try to push more incentives into the system for new companies to form?
All right, Betsey Stevenson, great to get your input today. Thank you so much for joining. She's professor of public policy and economics at the University of Michigan and Bloomberg opinion columnist. And coming up, Donald Trump makes a bold promise about crypto. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
This afternoon, I'm laying out my plan to ensure that the United States will be the crypto capital of the planet. They want to choke you. They want to choke you out of business. We're not going to let that happen.
Donald Trump earlier today teasing news on potential developments around his crypto policy. It's a tease that so far he's yet to deliver on, though he is still on stage speaking in Michigan about a number of economic policies, including those of Kamala Harris. When it comes to crypto, though, of course, this is not the first time we have heard him allude to being the crypto capital of the planet. He has said he wants all Bitcoin mined in the U.S. and is really trying to court the crypto vote and the crypto dollars in this election cycle, draw a contrast with Vice President Kamala Harris. Though I would point out, at the DNC in Chicago last week, Bloomberg had the chance to speak with Brian Nelson, senior campaign advisor for policy to the campaign, who told us that Harris is going to support policies that ensure emerging technologies and that sort of industry, like crypto, can continue to grow. So these are the kind of policy things that we're trying to tease out as we are now less than 70 days out from this election. As I mentioned, Donald Trump speaking right now in Michigan. One new policy he has just put forward. He says he announces today that if he is elected, the government will pay the insurance company for costs associated with IVF treatment. Reproductive rights, of course, central in this presidential campaign. And we'll have much more on the presidential election coming up, and specifically take a look at key congressional races to watch. We'll be joined by Kyle Kondik, managing editor of Sabato's Crystal Ball, next on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio, and we have breaking news from the campaign trail. Our new Bloomberg News Morning Consult swing state poll for the month of August is out now, and it shows Kamala Harris leading former President Trump in 6 of 7 swing states and tied in the 7th. Overall, across these 7 states, she is up by 2 points, and she has a wide lead, a significantly statistically one, in Wisconsin, where she's up by 8 points. So joining me now for more on this breaking news is Bloomberg's Gregory Cordy. So, Gregory, obviously this is a significant departure from where Joe Biden was polling when we were running these in months prior. And this is, while we're talking within the margin of error in many of these states, shows that this map is much wider for her than it was for Joe Biden.
Yeah, 2 months ago, we were talking about a very narrow path to victory for Joe Biden. You couldn't have counted him out. But he would have had to really, his path was through those blue wall states that we talk about so often, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin. They're northern industrial states, very union heavy, traditional Democratic stalwarts that went to Trump in 2016 and that Biden won back in 2020. With Kamala Harris on the ballot, it's a completely different map. It's a completely different chessboard because what she does is she opens up those Sun Belt states, those swing belt states of Arizona, Nevada, Georgia. And most interestingly on that map is North Carolina, which was a state that Donald Trump was winning by 10 points in our April poll. Frankly, a lot of pollsters stopped polling in North Carolina entirely, thinking he was out of reach. And so to see Kamala Harris up by 2 points, important to point out that's within the margin of error. Yeah. But 2 points in North Carolina would have been unthinkable just a few months ago. And the fact that she's even competitive there, she's forcing Donald Trump to spend money to defend it. And that's part of the chess game that we get into, especially after Labor Day, when the airwaves and all of these 7 states are going to get deluged with political ads.
Yeah, as you mentioned, up 2 in North Carolina. Just to run through the numbers in each state for our Bloomberg TV and radio audience, she's also up 2 in Georgia. She's up by 4 in both Nevada and Pennsylvania. Up by 8, as I said, in Wisconsin, 3 in Michigan. The state in which she's tied is Arizona. What else is significant about some of these polls is not just the headline figures when it comes to the state-by-state breakdown, but also on the issues. One of close to our hearts here at Bloomberg is the economy. I am struck by the fact that swing state voters trust her over Trump to help the middle class by a 7-point margin. Was this surprising to you, Gregory, the idea that the Biden economy that voters were really not happy with, an administration she's part of, she's not necessarily being drugged down by?
Yeah, what's really remarkable is that if you ask people how the economy is doing, their perception of it has not changed much over the past year. We've been doing this monthly tracking poll since last October. This is our 11th iteration of this. And people really aren't warming up to this economy. And a majority still say they were better off under Trump than they are under Biden. And yet, Kamala Harris does not seem to come with that Biden baggage on the economy. And so, as you point out, voters are trusting her on these economic issues more than they trusted Joe Biden. She's narrowing the gap. You mentioned the idea of, we asked who's better at protecting the middle class. She does well there. On the issue of housing costs, Joe Biden was 6 points underwater on that compared to Trump. Harris is 4 points ahead. So it's a 10-point swing in 2 months. She introduced this home ownership proposal where she's proposing giving $25,000 to first-time home buyers. That might have something to do with it. But on a number of issues, including health care costs and paychecks, she's also outperforming Trump, believe it or not.
Yeah, Trump still is outperforming her when it comes to the cost of everyday goods, we should point out. But there's other remarkable figures in here as well, including the protection of personal freedom. She's in the lead by 5 points across the swing states. What else stood out to you in this data, Gregory? Because we have a lot of it.
We do have a lot of it. And freedom is one that we specifically asked this month. We hadn't asked it before, but freedom, I think Harris mentioned, according to some accounts that I saw, the word freedom 11 or 12 times in her acceptance speech of the Democratic convention. It was really a conscious effort for Democrats to try to reclaim that word, which, if you go back 2 decades after 9/11, we got the Freedom Caucus of Republicans in the House. They renamed French fries Freedom Fries. It was a very sort of Republican concept, and so the fact that she is somewhat that she's actually ahead on that issue is kind of remarkable, because freedom is a buzzword that's more associated with Republicans recently. So, yeah, we have that. We asked about which of these candidates is more patriotic. Trump has a little bit of the edge there. And then we looked at the vice presidential candidates, because this is a year where J.D. Vance and Tim Walz, the Republican and Democratic running mates respectively, are really higher profile than usual. And what we found was that Tim Walz seems to be an asset to Kamala Harris in a way that J.D. Vance is not for Donald Trump. Walz is perceived as more experienced, more competent, more honest, and more compassionate. People are more likely to describe Vance as dangerous and, frankly, weird, which is the attack line that Walz has used against the Republicans. And when we asked if the selection of the running mates makes you more or less likely to vote for the top of the ticket, Walz has a considerable advantage there as well.
All right. Bloomberg's Gregory Cordy has been making sense of these numbers all day. Thank you so much for joining us. Now, this new polling does reinforce something that the co-chair of the RNC, Lara Trump, told me yesterday about where the Republican Party is focusing its spending. Here's what she had to say about putting more money into North Carolina.
North Carolina is definitely a state where we've seen some movement. It looked very positive for Donald Trump in whenever he was going against Joe Biden. It still shows Donald Trump up on Kamala Harris, but we want to make sure that we increase that lead. So we certainly are prepared to put more money into that state.
Joining us now for more is Kyle Kondik, managing editor of Sabato's Crystal Ball at the University of Virginia. Kyle, welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. Of course, Crystal Ball had recently moved North Carolina into the toss-up category, so I'm sure this might not be all too surprising for you to find the race tighter there. But I would love to just get your initial reaction to our new poll. Up 2 in North Carolina, but frankly, up everywhere except a tie in Arizona.
Yeah, I think the numbers are pretty much in keeping with what we've seen in recent weeks in some of the swing state polling. There is that big lead for Harris in Wisconsin, and this is not to single you guys out because I think it's been a challenge in that state in particular. But polling has, generally speaking, kind of understated Donald Trump in both 2016 and 2020 in the swing states. And that was probably the most pronounced in Wisconsin in both states. So, I think whenever you see in these really close states, you see a result that's maybe really favorable for one candidate or the other, take it with a grain of salt. But I find the numbers to be broadly believable. One key sort of question here that we're just in the midst of right now is, what kind of bounce did Kamala Harris get out of her convention? Is this hitting her at kind of a high point, or is this going to be sort of more stable going forward here? But by and large, I think the numbers are pretty reasonable.
Well, and of course, the numbers in Georgia we take note of as well. She is also up 2 points in that state, and that's where she is as we speak. She has a rally in Savannah. She's been on a bus tour specifically of rural Georgia along with Tim Walz for the last 2 days. And I spoke about the state of Georgia earlier with Andra Gillespie of Emory University, and this is what she told me about the types of voters Harris needs to attract there.
Black voters make up more than half of all Democratic voters in the state of Georgia. So you have to have that strong base of support, and then you have to build on it. So that does include college-educated liberals in the metro Atlanta suburbs. That includes Latino voters who are spread across the state and might not necessarily be in the urban centers in the state. That includes Asian American voters in the suburbs.
Kyle, how should we be thinking about the demographic appeal that at least polling suggests is more able to tap into in some of these critical battleground states?
Yeah, I think the professor is spot on in her comments. And I also think that it is just important for Harris to be showing up in places that are not the, huge urban cores of these states. And I think she's done a decent job of that. I think that was sort of a hallmark for Obama in both 2008 and 2012, and Biden, actually, when Biden was Obama's running mate. And also, Trump has been really smart, I think, in terms of the places he goes. Going to places where the presidential candidate showing up is actually a pretty big deal and getting big crowds. We've seen that for Harris, too. But again, it's not just hitting, if you're in Georgia, it's not just hitting Atlanta, or it's not just hitting Milwaukee or Detroit. It's getting out to some places that are smaller and, trying to scratch and claw for every vote. It's hard to quantify what the effect of these visits are. Probably not really all that much. But, the most valuable resource the candidates have is their own time. And I think it's wise to go to a lot of places and ask people for their votes.
And of course, it's not just people who need to decide who they'd like to vote for President, Kyle, but also who they want to represent them in the Senate and in the House. In a number of these states we're talking about, there are Senate races we're watching in Arizona, for example, where she's now tied with Donald Trump, according to our latest polling. We've also seen polling from Fox News out today that suggests Democrat Ruben Gallego is polling double digits ahead of Republican Carrie Lake. How are you considering what we're seeing in states like that, or Nevada with Jackie Rosen, for example, and the effect the Harris candidacy is having?
It has been pretty common, even when Biden was running, to see Democrats in Senate races doing way better than the top of the ticket. I think if you ask people on both sides of the Senate contest, I've actually been doing that the past couple of days, talking to people involved, and I don't think anyone believes that Gallego's actually up 15 points in Arizona. The presidential is tied there. I do think those races will tighten. The presidential and the Senate races will converge. But I think that Democrats have to feel confident, at least in some of these states, that their candidates can do a little bit better than Harris does. And look, states have not really been splitting their tickets that much between Senate and presidential elections in recent years. But you could imagine a world where, like, Ruben Gallego wins by a point or two, but Trump wins the state too by a point or two. Democrats are still considerable underdogs in the race for the Senate, but they haven't been knocked out yet, and we're here at basically at Labor Day.
Yeah, and it is worth pointing out that the Hill-Emerson poll does have Gallego up by a much smaller margin, roughly 7 points. We were just showing that for our Bloomberg TV audience. So as we consider the expanded map for Kamala Harris with much of the Sun Belt in play, do you see an expanded map for Democrats in the Senate? We've heard Chuck Schumer alluding to notions around Texas and Florida. Kyle, do you find any of that actually believable?
I think that both Texas and Florida are kind of on the periphery of the map, although I don't think that Kamala Harris can really get within, a point or two in those states. I just think they're a little more Republican than that. And the other challenge for Democrats is that you think about these sort of big outside groups that spend all these money in these races. Florida and Texas are huge states with huge media markets. And, you can't just dip your toe in if you're, Senate Majority PAC, which is the big outside funder on the Democratic side of the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee. If you're going to play in those states, you got to play big. And I just don't necessarily know if the dollars are there or if they're really real targets. I mean, I think the Democrats do have to try to sell playing offense somewhere, because basically the whole competitive map is just Democratic defense, which is a little dispiriting. Of Texas and Florida, my understanding is that Texas is maybe the more plausible target for Democrats, but I think Ted Cruz is still pretty clearly favored in that state.
Yeah, although a poll last week did show Colin Allred only behind by about 2 points. Finally, Kyle, before we let you go, got to ask you about the House as well. Democrats still maintain they just want those 4 seats to reclaim the majority. But what figure do you think might be realistic? Do you see more pickup opportunities? Again, the House playing field is relatively small. I mean, we, 435 House seats in our crystal ball ratings. We have 19 toss-ups. Maybe some would quibble with the numbers a little bit here and there. My general sense has been, I think that the presidential or the House is likely to go the way of the presidential, but the majority for the Republicans is so small that maybe you could imagine a split decision where the Democrats get 220 seats or something, and Donald Trump narrowly wins. But and some of the battleground districts are in the battleground states, like in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Arizona. But a lot of those districts are in, like, New York and California, that are not presidential battlegrounds at all, but could very well decide who controls the House. All right, Kyle Kondik, managing editor of Sabato's Crystal Ball. Great to have you back. Thanks so much for joining. And coming up, we'll take a closer look at our brand new Bloomberg News Morning Consult swing state poll. Again, Harris up by 2 points across the 7 battleground states. Our political panel will weigh in next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Since Kamala Harris has entered the race, there have been a couple of polls that have suggested that she's ahead, but all of these polls put Harris and Trump within a couple of percentage points of each other, which is clearly a statistical tie. So that suggests that Georgia is still in play.
That was Andra Gillespie, Associate Professor of Political Science at Emory University, earlier today about the battle for Georgia this November. And of course, Bloomberg News and Morning Consult just released new data for Georgia and the other 6 swing states that finds Kamala Harris up 2 points against Donald Trump across them. She's actually leading in 6 of the 7. The one state in which they are tied is Arizona. So for more on this now, joining me is our political panel, Ashley Davis, former Homeland Security official and Republican strategist, alongside Democratic strategist Adam Hodge of Bully Pulpit International. Great to have you both here. This is hot off the presses. Up 2 points in Georgia and North Carolina, up 4 points in Pennsylvania and Nevada, 3 in Michigan, 8 in Wisconsin, and then, as I said, Arizona is a tie. Adam, looking at this and the map, it does suggest Kamala Harris now has available to her. What does the campaign do with data like this, knowing she just spent the last 2 days in Georgia?
They do what they're doing. They are getting on the ground. They are going to every possible nook and cranny of every swing state. They've got 300 field offices around the country. They had thousands of volunteers around the country. They're telling them all, don't read the poll, go knock some doors. Like that is what the polls do not vote, the people do. Get out on the ground and work every last day until Election Day, because it's great to have the enthusiasm. We have seen the consolidation. Your poll just reflects what we've seen over the last month. They have to turn that energy and enthusiasm into real hard votes. And that's the objective over the next 68 days.
So if that's how the Harris campaign will look at it, what about the Trump campaign? Is this just a list of places you have to spend more money?
Well, absolutely. And they were spending all their money there anyway. But I think places like Georgia and North Carolina are what's concerning. I mean, obviously, it's still in the margin of error, and there's a long way to go. But those states when we were trying to be in play, we meaning Republicans in Virginia, a month ago. And so that is like nowhere even on the map. And the momentum's for her. What I was sitting here thinking when you were speaking is, she probably can't run as an underdog anymore, which is kind of the message was what she wanted, because to get people out to vote, right? Because I think if you look back in 2016 to what happened with Hillary Clinton is that everyone thought she was going to win. Right now, the momentum is for the vice president. Everyone kind of thinks she's going to win. And so just making sure that their votes do get out. But yeah, I'd be concerned if I was the president. And President Trump, he can't continue to make fun of her or, say these things that are off the cuff that just alienate more and more and more people, especially women. And so that's not the defense. He needs to talk about the economy. He needs to talk about the border, which he is, on your poll, he is still above on both of those issues. But that's what he should just be talking about, not calling her names.
Some parts of the economy, for example, who's better trusted to help the middle class? It's Harris up by 7 points. On housing costs, Harris has a 4-point advantage. Is the economy still the best line of attack for Donald Trump? If voters seem to be thinking differently about the way she would approach economic issues than the president she has been serving with for 3.5 years.
I still think people are very concerned about the cost of gas, the cost of insurance, the cost of groceries. So I don't think he changes that message right now. But she is resonating with the middle class, and some of her policies that she's been today doing a tax credit for small startup businesses, obviously what she's talking about in regards to just various issues. I think it's resonating with the middle class.
Well, and of course, there's also the down payment assistance, to Ashley's point, some of the things she said, price gouging as well. We do have questions about the actual economics and fiscal responsibility of a lot of these things, but maybe that's what's showing up in this poll to a wide degree. Something else she has an advantage over is a 5-point margin of advantage over personal freedom. We heard, and you were at the DNC in Chicago like I was last week, Adam, a lot about freedom. Entire nights were themed for it. Is that going to be a winning issue for Kamala Harris?
It certainly seems like a winning issue right now. And I think you combine her clear strength on the economy with a clear advantage on reproductive freedom. That is showing that the convention worked, that they had a message. They drove it all week at the convention. The American people heard it, and they're responding to it. Now, this is Bloomberg, so we'll do a little numbers and data, right? Like, it helps the GDP today, 3%, revised up. Treasury came out with a report recently that showed wages actually rose faster than inflation by about $1,400. So there's some real tangible improvements in the economy. Consumer confidence also this week showed it went up, right? So you're seeing people feeling better about the economy. You're seeing, so it's no surprise that her polling on the economy has also improved. But again, she has to go earn the vote, and that is the key for the next 68 days.
Do you think, and I'm sorry for interrupting you, but do you think that it's too late for the economy for just if you're in Iowa, I'm just picking a state, and you're going to the grocery store, do you think, obviously the economy is moving in the right direction, 100% agree with you, but do you think it's going to impact people enough by November?
I think it will,
egg prices to go down.
But she's also putting ideas on the table, right? You can say you may take issue with some of them. Some Republicans are never going to be for her plans on housing or on prices. But she's putting ideas on the table, and she can credibly say, Donald Trump, show me what you got. And so far, besides standing next to a can of coffee, he doesn't really have a whole lot of plans.
It is worth pointing out some of her ideas, though, have changed over the course of time. And she was actually asked about it in this sit-down interview that will air fully on CNN later tonight. But we heard an excerpt about her flip-flopping policy that CNN released. Here's what she said.
Dana, I think the most important and most significant aspect of my policy perspective and decisions is my values have not changed. My value around what we need to do to secure our border, that value has not changed. I spent 2 terms as the Attorney General of California prosecuting transnational criminal organizations, violations of American laws regarding the illegal passage of guns, drugs, and human beings across our border. My values have not changed.
Ashley, the Trump war room is going off already on the values thing. Is that an argument that works when we're talking about changing your entire policy when it comes to fracking?
No, I mean, that's where I do think that she does. I know she's come out with a few of her, economic policies, which I do agree with you on, but she needs to come out with why fracking's different. Okay, I understand that she was the Attorney General, but she was in charge of the border also for the last 4 years, and so she needs to talk about what her policies will be at the border, what her policies will be on fracking. Another clip that did come out today as well is why she supports but doesn't support the Green New Deal. So, I mean, she's got to come up with, and maybe she doesn't. I mean, I'm saying that as a Republican, that you would think she needs to put these policies in place, but maybe there's enough enthusiasm for her. Well, we'll see. I think that tonight's interview, and I also think the debate, we'll see if these numbers will continue.
Well, so I guess, Adam, to your point about the momentum and the energy that Democrats are experiencing that may be evident in our poll, could this interview tonight, when it fully airs, not really serve as necessarily a continued upward catalyst, but be maybe the first thing that arrests her momentum?
I don't think the polling is going to, one interview is going to fundamentally change the race and the trends that we've been seeing. I also think it is, people will respond to her saying, like, these are my values. I have also learned in the job. I have a different perspective, but who I am at my core has not changed. I think that is also something, is a stark contrast to President Trump. Like, his values, who knows where they are, right? Like, they're one day he's for IVFs and one day he's against it, right? Like, those are all things that are clearly flip-flop and change for him. So her speaking to her values, I think, is a smart home place to be. And then she's got to then lay out the policy going forward.
We just have a minute left, Adam, but should she have done this interview solo rather than have Tim Walz join her?
I think this is like the media making a whole mountain out of nothing. Like, you go back 20 years.
It's not just the media. Donald Trump is too.
Okay, Donald Trump is too. But you look like John Kerry and John Edwards did the same thing. Obama and Biden right after the convention did it. Trump and Mike Pence did a joint interview right after the debate.
Well, so did Trump and J.D. Vance.
Right, it is pretty par for the course and standard. People who follow politics know, like, this is kind of what you do after the campaign. She's going to do others. I don't doubt she's going to do a one-on-one sit-down interview. And then we'll have the debate, and it'll be her and Trump together.
I just have to say, though, but this is the first one she has done as a presidential candidate. Not all those other people have done it with their vice president.
She's done 80 as vice president.
The distinction. I have a feeling these two are going to keep it going once the show's over. Thank you both so much for joining, Ashley Davis and Adam Hodge. We'll see you back here tomorrow on Bloomberg TV and radio.